What should defending counsel do when he believes his client is guilty? Of all the problems that arise to plague a barrister, this one is surely the most familiar. It is constantly debated by all kinds of people, just as if Johnson hadn't settled it 2 centuries ago. "What do you think," Boswell had asked him, "of supporting a cause you know to be bad?" "Sir," Johnson answered, "you do not know it is good or bad till the judge determines it. It is his business to judge, and you are not to be confident in your opinion that a cause is bad, but to say all you can for your client and then hear the judge's opinion. Read jury for judge in this admirable analysis, and it can usefully be extended to cover criminal trials." Let the advocate follow Johnson's wise advice, and the famous question is rapidly disposed of. There is another problem, though much knottier than this, which is far less often made the subject of discussion. Suppose defending counsel is convinced of his client's innocence. Suppose that nonetheless he sees great risk of being found guilty. What should he do then? The temptation is apparent: to depart from the beaten track of advocacy in frantic endeavor to procure means of escape. Such departures are conceived in a spirit of self-sacrifice, and counsel often suffer for them grievously. Dr. Keneally was formally disbarred for his fanatical defense of the Tichborne claimant. Marshall Hall's practice was seriously damaged by the bluntness of his language when he thought a judge unfair, and Edward Abinger, a lesser man than these but able and sincere, raised up against himself a whirlwind of criticism by his unorthodox defense of Steinie Morrison. Steinie Morrison was brought up at the Old Bailey in March 1911, and there charged with murdering Leon Barron, whose body, stripped of money and valuables, had been found on Clapham Common early on New Year's Day. He had been killed by a series of blows upon the head, and after death had been stabbed and cut about the face. A doctor, who saw his body at 9 o'clock that morning, formed the view that Barron had then been dead 6 hours. Legend soon grows around a classic crime, and Barron has been spoken of as rich and old. He was not old, he was 48. He was not rich. His yearly income was but £25, derived from some small property. But notwithstanding this, he always carried money on him. Often there would be 30 sovereigns in his purse. He also sported a massive watch and chain, which it was one of his foibles to show off to acquaintances. Neither chain nor watch nor money was found upon his corpse. Barron did not live near Clapham Common, nor has it ever been discovered what induced him to go out there. He lodged with his brother near the Mile End Road and spent most of his time in a cheap Whitechapel eating-house. This place, the Warsaw Restaurant, forms an exceptionally outlandish patch in the fantastic background to the crime. The Warsaw Restaurant served as a kind of club for the curious foreign colony to which Barron belonged. They came there early, and they stayed there late. They ate, talked, sat about, dozed, meditated, quarreled, and then ate again. They may have gone to bed elsewhere, but for many of them, the Warsaw Restaurant was home. Barron not least. For years, it had been his habit to settle there each day at 2 o'clock and remain till about 12. In the last few weeks of 1910, one Steinie Morrison joined the corps of regulars. That is, he would call at the Warsaw nearly every day, though he limited his visits to more rational proportions. This Steinie was a striking, even fascinating figure, well-spoken, handsome, and magnificently built. He must have looked out of his element in that bizarre assembly, as if Apollo at a fairground had strayed among the freaks. What could there be in common between this dashing newcomer and the short, stumpy, eccentric little Barron? Perhaps opposites attracted, or secret interests coalesced. At any rate, the couple spent a lot of time together, and they were often observed deep in private conversation during the last days of the dying year. Barron, faithful to his custom, sat on at the Warsaw right through New Year's Eve. He left only a few minutes before the bells rang in a year which was to grant him so short a breathing space. He left, it was alleged, with Steinie Morrison. Some 3 hours later, he was cruelly clubbed to death. The results achieved by following this pointer provided the quintessence of the prosecution's charge. Steinie's case sprang into instant notoriety, as the riddle of the Scarlet S. This tag owed its origin to two of the slashes on the dead man's face, which were spoken of as S-shaped by a doctor at the inquest. Many people took this rough description literally and indulged in the most wild and fanciful conjectures. Some thought they were the symbol of an anarchist society. Some thought they stood for tick, the Russian word for spy. Some, and these were the most gullible of all, believed that the assassin had recorded his initial. None of these theories was shared by Scotland Yard, nor did they cut much ice at the Old Bailey. "Anyone," said the presiding judge, "who sees the letter S in either of these scratches has either better eyes than I or a more vivid imagination." But there was no need of a scarlet S to make Steinie's trial dramatic. No case in the whole history of crime has worked up more feverish, uncontrolled excitement. Outside the court, in London's Foreign Quarter, witnesses were coaxed, threatened, drilled, and even beaten by partisan groups, owing warped allegiance either to Barron's family or the prisoner. At the Old Bailey itself, as day succeeded day, angry scene succeeded angry scene, between counsel and witness, between counsel and judge, between counsel and counsel. The tension, beginning at a morbid pitch, contrived uncannily to rise with every hour until at the end it grew almost beyond bearing. Wholly beyond bearing for one interested party. During Abinger's impassioned closing speech, Leon Barron's brother went clean out of his mind. Raving and gibbering, he hurled himself at counsel. He was dragged off, pinioned, and taken from the court to permanent lodgment in a madhouse cell. Such a shocking and sensational occurrence would have completely overshadowed any other case. In the trial of Steinie Morrison, it was a passing incident. On Monday, March 6th, the trial began. Mr. Justice Darling took his seat upon the bench. Steinie was put up in the dock. When asked to plead, he said, "My lord, if I were standing before the Almighty, I could give but one answer. I am not guilty." The theatrical note was struck at once, and the curtain forthwith rose on a tumultuous drama that was to play to crowded houses for 9 eventful days. The two chief forensic actors were Abinger himself and Richard Muir. They fitted the popular conception of their roles. Abinger, defending, was impulsive and emotional. Muir for the Crown was long-headed and case-hardened. A tough rock of a man who never spared himself or others, he had powers of endurance that seemed almost inexhaustible. He did not greatly care for kid-glove methods, and the case against Morrison was mercilessly pressed to the uttermost limits permitted by the law. Muir's opening speech was characteristically thorough. It consisted in the main of solid narrative, occasionally seasoned with a comment strictly practical. He told how Steinie had become a friend of Barron's, how he had been seen examining Barron's watch, how on New Year's Eve he had turned up at the Warsaw with a long paper parcel which he said contained a flute, how a waiter who handled it thought it felt like an iron bar, how Steinie was familiar with the Clapham Common district, how straight after the murder he had deserted his old haunts, how he never again set foot inside the Warsaw, how he forsook his lodging in Newark Street nearby and went to share the room of a prostitute in Lambeth, how till the moment of the murder he had been hard up, how henceforward he was flush, how at a station cloakroom on New Year's morning he deposited a package containing a revolver. Anticipating arrest? Muir slyly inquired. How exactly a week later, when Steinie was arrested, slight human bloodstains were detected on his shirt. Thus was woven a fine web of suspicion, but all was subsidiary to Muir's main contention. That from midnight, Steinie had been Barron's sole companion and was with him at Clapham Common shortly before 3. The prosecutor was emphatic here. Slowly and impressively, he dealt his strongest cards. It would be proved, he said, that from midnight onwards, the pair had walked together in the streets of the East End. It would be proved that at 2 o'clock they took a cab to Clapham, alighting by the Common about 20 to 3. It would be proved that at 3:15 a cab was hailed at Clapham by a man who gave the driver the vague direction, Kennington. That man, Muir said, was Steinie, and he was alone. This timetable was the real crux of the case. It depended on two separate groups of witnesses. The first consisted of Whitechapel inhabitants who had previously known Barron or Morrison, or both. The second consisted of the cab drivers concerned, whose fares were naturally unknown to them at the time, but who claimed to have subsequently identified Steinie when given the opportunity at a police station parade. These witnesses were bound to be of paramount importance. If their evidence in the box lived up to Muir's opening, Steinie's chances would look very slim indeed. The formal and semi-formal witnesses had departed. The plans had been produced and the photographs received. Now the Crown called for Solomon Barron, and the temperature embarked on its uninterrupted rise. The dead man's brother typified those unassimilated aliens for whom the Warsaw restaurant was the center of the world. He might almost have been peering out from that esoteric spot, puzzled, hostile, infinitely suspicious. He didn't like the methods of this damn fool country. They let Steinie kill his brother and then allowed him a defense. Solomon's mental instability was immediately apparent. Prosecuting counsel found him difficult to manage while he gave some simple evidence about his brother's habits. When Abinger got up to cross-examine, the witness did not trouble to conceal his rage. "Did you describe yourself," he was asked, "as an independent gentleman?" "Yes." "Are you living in a Roten house at 7 pence a night?" Barron went up in smoke. "What has that to do with the case?" Anger made his foreign accent even more pronounced. "What has that to do with the crime? If you ask me impudent questions, I will not answer you." "Did anybody help the deceased man with his rent?" "You go and ask him. I cannot tell you. If you ask me silly questions, I will give you no answer." Abinger ran his eye over the independent gentleman who lived at Roten House. Solomon Barron was tidy, almost smart, in a big dark overcoat with a velvet collar. "You look very nicely dressed. Where did those clothes come from?" In studying these questions, it is not easy to perceive what useful object Abinger had in view. Solomon Barron's evidence did not implicate the prisoner, and there was little to be gained by an attack upon his credit. If it was meant merely to goad him, it succeeded. The witness was now almost beside himself with fury. "Very well," he shouted. "You want to know where these clothes came from? I am not going to tell you." Then, as Mr. Justice Darling stirred slightly, he added, "If the judge asks me, I will tell you." "You must answer the question," said the judge quietly. Barron bowed to this ruling, but he would not deal with Abinger. He addressed himself directly to the judge. "If I must answer the question, you may tell him that I have brought over to London about £100 that I have saved in Paris from my business." Mr. Justice Darling preserved impassive silence. Abinger continued. He had one important point that it was necessary to put, and which might, with profit, have been put earlier. It was to be part of the defense that the witnesses from the Warsaw, prompted by a kind of tribal loyalty to Baron, had in concert shaped their evidence to ensure he was avenged. This suggestion received the usual warm reception. "I do not take any interest in it," Solomon Barron stormed. "It has nothing to do with this case. Do not put me so many questions, or I will go out from here." But Abinger persisted. "How many hours each day do you pass at the Warsaw?" "All the time I got." "What time do you get there?" "About 1 o'clock. I do not spend all the time." "Where else do you spend your time?" "I go nowhere else." "Nowhere else?" "Only to my business." "What business?" This pressure upon his rocking mind was more than Solomon Barron could endure. "I go to my solicitor's," he yelled. "What are you laughing at? I cannot see the joke. What are you laughing at?" The veins bulged from his forehead. Frenzy was consuming him like fire. When presently he stumbled from the box, the temper of the trial had been irrevocably set. Let us pause a moment and take stock of the position as the defense would see it at the end of the first day. In a long trial, as Steinie's was clearly bound to be, this is often the crucial moment for planning defense strategy. The Crown case has been revealed. Its strength and weakness can be approximately assessed. With tolerable certitude, the prisoner's advocate, can chart his future course. Abinger had thrown himself into the fight for Steinie with all the ardor of his generous nature. That first evening, one may be absolutely sure, he spent many hours in hard and anxious thought. His main task stood out. If he was to have any chance of gaining an acquittal, he must smash the crown story of Steinie's New Year's night. He must break that chain of evidence which linked his client so damningly with the time, the place, and the victim of the murder. In other words, he must satisfy the jury that some or all those witnesses ought not to be believed. Under the strict but beneficent rules of British legal practice, there is more than one method of inducing disbelief. You may seek to show mistake. This was the obvious way of handling the cab drivers who claimed to recognize a stranger they had only once set eyes on, and that in the doubtful darkness of the night. You may seek to show lying. Something of that kind had already been foreshadowed in the questions put by Abinger to Baron. And you may seek to establish the witness's bad character, to show that he is a person of such dubious morality that his sworn statement is unworthy of belief. Any jury will think again and yet again before convicting on the word of a blackmailer or thief. The attack upon character, appropriately used, gives the defender an invaluable weapon. But it is a weapon capable of boomerang effect. If it is used by the defense against a witness for the Crown, it may be used by the Crown against the prisoner himself. The latter thus forfeits his right to be protected against any mention of his record or his past. Of course, if you have neither a record nor a past, this is of no consequence. You may make attacks on character with comparative impunity. But Abinger's client was not in that happy position. The handsome Steinie, impressing all beholders by his dignity of bearing, was a convict by status and a burglar by trade. To attack or not? Here was a grave decision, perhaps the gravest in the case, and it must be made that night. For Abinger had reason to suppose that the Crown was not invulnerable on the score of character, and that the chance of proving this would be offered him next day. But if he took that chance, if he made character an issue, he would make Steinie liable to similar attack. It is easy to criticize in subsequent detachment, far from the arena's dust and heat. Nonetheless, one cannot help expressing the opinion that in Steinie's case it was unwise to take the risk. Abinger thought differently. He had already discussed the matter with his client, who had approved, maybe even instigated, the adoption of bold tactics. But counsel of experience advise their clients. They are not advised by them. Abinger would have been the last to deny that in the ultimate resort, the decision was his own. He decided to attack. The next morning, the first witness was Joe Mintz. He was the waiter from the Warsaw restaurant who had thought Steinie's parcel much too heavy for a flute. "Have you ever tried to hang yourself?" Abinger asked him. "That has nothing to do with the case," the witness snapped. Frequenters of the Warsaw seemed curiously prone to ex cathedra pronouncements upon relevance. But is it true? It is true, but it has got nothing to do with the case. And did you afterwards go to Colney Hatch Asylum? Yes, I have been there. At this point, Mr. Justice Darling intervened. I suppose you realize, Mr. Abinger, that suicide is a felony, and that you are asking this man whether he attempted a felony? If your lordship thinks I should not pursue this, Abinger began. The judge was quick with a correction. I'm not saying you should not pursue it, Mr. Abinger. I did not quite know whether you knew what it might lead to. Darling was, in fact, making absolutely sure that Abinger did not expose his client to unnecessary danger through mere forgetfulness or misreading of the rules. In effect, the judge was offering a reminder. If you attack character, you in turn will be attacked. Whether these questions to Mintz really constituted an attack on character in the strictly legal sense is a question that will always be open to debate. The judge apparently considered that they did. But Abinger maintained with some plausibility that he was not seeking to impute an offense, but to establish that Mintz was mentally deranged. The point, to say the least of it, was arguable. Before the end of the day, though, it had become academic. An attack by Abinger upon one Mrs. Deach put the Mintz affair completely in the shade. Mrs. Deitch's evidence was awkward for the prisoner. She swore she had seen him in Whitechapel with Barron on New Year's morning between 1 and 2 o'clock. That came uncomfortably close to the time when they were supposed to have set off for Clapham in a cab. Mrs. Deitch had had a rough passage at the police court. Rightly anticipating a similar ordeal, she had worked herself up into a fine state of resentment. If Abinger was lying in wait for her, Mrs. Deitch was equally lying in wait for him. There were no preliminaries, no smooth approaches, no subtle skirting round. Both parties got to grips at once like a pair of fighting cocks. "What is your husband?" was Abinger's first question. "He is a gas fitter." "And what are you?" The path to insolence lay wide open. Mrs. Deitch was in no mood to reject it. "What am I? I am a woman, of course." "I can see that," said Abinger. "But what is your occupation?" "That is a fine question to ask me," Mrs. Deitch exclaimed with what must have seemed at that moment excessive sensitivity. "I am at home in the house, looking after my children." "Do you know a woman named Lizzie Holmes?" "No." "You pledge your oath she did not live in your house?" "I have never had any girls living in my house." "Didn't Lizzie Holmes have a room with you, for which she paid you 3 shillings a week?" "No." Then they came. The questions intended to encompass the route of Mrs. Deitch, but which carried in their train the destruction of another. Used she to take men in? No such thing. Did they not sleep with her, or stay a short time? Never. Did she not pay you 3 shillings for every man that stopped all night? That is an untruth. And a shilling for every man that stopped a short time. I never heard of such a thing. Where did you get that fur from? That is my business. Tell us, please. Mrs. Deitch now gave way to that uninhibited rage which was the sign manual of actors in this extraordinary trial. "Why should I tell you?" She spat the words at Abinger. "You insulted me last time, but you will not insult me today. You asked me last time where I got my fur from. My husband bought it, what he worked for. I do not ask you where your wife got her fur from." Abinger prudently ignored this impudent riposte. He continued, however, to press for information about this Lizzie Holmes. Hadn't she followed Mrs. Deitch from one house to another? Hadn't Mrs. Deitch sent for her? Wasn't there a specific occasion in March of last year when Lizzie had gone with a man, and Mrs. Deitch had got 10 shillings? All of which gave rise to further vehement denials. When the string of questions at last came to an end, the judge inquired if Lizzie Holmes was present. She was not. "I expect her here tomorrow," said Mr. Justice Darling, "and this witness shall be here also." Abinger did better than had been desired. When the court resumed the next day, not only Lizzie Holmes but 4 other harlots lined up before the box. Each in turn confronted Mrs. Deitch. Each in turn was flatly disavowed. The girls shouted, "Liar!" Mrs. Deitch shouted back, and the episode was suspended on this inconclusive note. So far the comic element was uppermost, but the seeds of tragedy had been already sowed. The jury's view of Mrs. Deitch can only be conjectured. They may have thought she was a back-street procuress. They may have thought she was a lady wickedly traduced. But from Steinie's standpoint, the sole test was this. Were they now any less likely to believe that she had seen him with Baron where and when she said? It was the breaking of the Crown's timetable that mattered, not whether people kept a stew or tried to hang themselves. Unhappily, the uproar raised over the latter tended to obscure Abinger's march towards the former. In between the angry scenes, all through the second day, he had been quietly displacing various props of Muir's case. Mrs. Deitch herself had conceded a point which, unlike her morals, was of primary concern. She still insisted she had seen Leon Barron with the prisoner, but under Abinger's cross-examination was driven to declare she had been mistaken in the time. She fixed it now at 2:15. A quarter of an hour after, on the prosecution's showing, Steinie and Barron left for Clapham in the cab. This was a very valuable advance, and gained without running any countervailing risk. Then there was Weisberg, who swore he had seen Steinie walking with Baron at about 12:45. Abinger ascertained that this witness had had supper at the Warsaw, that he had left there shortly after 8 in company with one Zaltzman, and that they were still together shortly before 1. Asked to recount their movements in the interval, Weisberg could only say that they had walked about. "You must have been getting rather weary," Abinger suggested. "I met a girlfriend," replied Weisberg, as though this had kept him going, "and I had a conversation with her." "So the 3 of you walked about, you and Zaltzman and the girl? The girl left us about 11? Then did you and Zaltzman go on walking until 1:45? Yes? Where?" "Backwards and forwards, from Aldgate to Mile End." "How many times?" 5 or 6 or more." "You would then be getting very tired," remarked Abinger with sarcasm. "Yes, we got very tired," said the witness innocently. Weisberg's story now sounded ludicrous, but Abinger's full triumph was only consummated when Zaltzman followed his friend into the box. As witnesses were kept out of court until they gave their testimony, Zaltzman, of course, knew nothing of what had just transpired. He repeated the tale of the protracted, pointless walk, and then, once again, it was Abinger's turn. "Did you meet anybody," he asked, "besides Morrison and Baron?" "No." "Think carefully whether you did not meet someone else, and walk with someone else." Did the witness then half guess, and did he try a sporting shot? At any rate, he permitted his memory to be jogged. "Oh yes, someone else walked with us, but I do not know him by name." Abinger was expressionless. "Anybody else besides that man?" "Nobody else spoke to us besides that man." Abinger sat down. When Muir, re-examining, put a leading question, "Did you have any conversation with a woman?" Abinger objected, and the judge rightly forbade this attempt to reconstitute a broken-down position. Messrs. Weisberg and Zaltzman had been settled for good by the invisible girlfriend and the 5-hour promenade. The first part of the timetable was looking somewhat shaky. It had seemed far more convincing on the lips of Mr. Muir. If this had been a normal case, conventionally conducted, the deciding factor would have been the evidence of the cabmen. Even amid the shoals of red herrings and the hysterical spasms that marked Steinie's trial, it was obvious that a great deal must depend on Abinger's handling of these key witnesses. In a sense, of course, their evidence was only indirect, but indirect evidence can be powerfully persuasive if the jury took these men at their face value, if they thought them neither dishonest nor mistaken, if they believed in the drives to and from Clapham and that Baron and Steinie were the passengers concerned. Then one would surely plead with them in vain to look upon it all as pure coincidence. Juries are seldom scholastic logicians. They deal in probabilities, not absolutes. In one respect, the cabmen lay wide open to attack. Recognizing someone at the time is one thing. Identifying someone subsequently is another, especially when a substantial period has elapsed. If you say, "I saw so-and-so whom I know," the room for error there is infinitesimally small. If you say, "This is a stranger whom I saw on one occasion," the room for error there is almost without limit, and this was what, in sum, the cab drivers were saying when they picked out Steinie at the police station parade. The whole technique of parades has been justly criticized, though it is hard to see what method could be adopted in its stead. It certainly offers opportunities for abuse: the long halt, the lifted eyebrow, the hand-picked crowd from which the wretched suspect unwillingly stands out. But deliberate rigging is exceptional. As a rule, no doubt, every effort is made to be fair. There are, however, certain defects which are inherent in the system. The more distinguished-looking your suspect, the less easy to place him with men reasonably like. The less contrasted your full lineup, the more encouragement to guesswork. And, worst of all, if a case has already had considerable publicity, the witness may no longer be identifying a person. He may merely identify the source of a description or the original of a photograph. Abinger seized upon this latter point when he came to cross-examine Heyman. Heyman was the first of the Crown's cab drivers, and in lawyers' jargon he came right up to proof. On New Year's night he had been in Mile End with his hansom. He had been hailed and engaged by two men. He had set them down on their request at Clapham. One of the men was short, not more than 5'5". The other he had since picked out as the accused. "And when did you first go to the police?" Abinger asked. "About a week afterwards, either the 9th or 10th. Before you went to the police, did you see the evening news of the 9th with a description of Morrison?" "No." "If you didn't see it, why had you not been to the police on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th? "Well, I went to the station as soon as I could." "Why did you not go before the 9th? "I don't know." Abinger held up a police notice. "This is dated the 6th of January. Did you see it?" "It was down in the cab yard." "Then if you saw this police notice offering a reward to cabmen, why did you not go to the station till the 9th or 10th? "I went when I thought proper. Why did you not go before?" Heyman was now at the end of his excuses. "I can't give you a reason," he said. "When were you taken to identify the man?" "On the 17th. "Had you seen portraits of the accused in the newspapers before you went to identify him?" "Yes." This was an unqualified success for the defense. It seemed possible, if not probable, that Heyman had relied less on a genuine recollection of his fare than on what he had seen in the press and on posters. The second cabman, Stevens, made a similar admission. He had seen a portrait before going to the police, but this fact was overshadowed by a further new development which Abinger exploited with admirable skill. For the Crown to gain its purpose, the cabmen's times must dovetail, as they had done so perfectly in Muir's opening speech. Heyman in the witness box had spoken, as forecast, of leaving Mile End at 2 and reaching Clapham at 2:40. Stevens now took up the tale. He had been with his cab at Clapham Cross, where he was hired by the supposed Steinie at 12 minutes past 3. This conveniently earmarked half an hour for carrying out the murder and any accessories thereto. Abinger had a document passed up to this witness. Stevens looked at it without enthusiasm. "Is that the statement you made to the police on January 10th? "Yes. I am going to read it." The first few sentences were merely introductory. Abinger rattled them off as one in duty bound. Soon, though, he went slower, glancing up at times, giving each word due emphasis and weight. "I remained on the rank until just before 2:30, when a man alone came from the direction of the old town, Clapham. He said, 'Kennington,' and then got in the cab. I have seen a photograph of Steinie Morrison and identify him as being that man." Abinger laid the paper down deliberately. "So you told the police that you picked this man up at 2:30? "I told the police I was not sure of the time, but it was about 1 hour after the last tram. The police asked me the time of the last tram, and I said it was about 1:30. You know, don't you, that if your statement is true that you picked up the man at 2:30, Heyman's evidence cannot be true, because according to that he would be in Heyman's cab at that time?" The form of this question left out of account the possibility that they had carried two entirely different men. But here, Abinger was tactically justified in dealing with juries, one point at a time. According to Heyman, at 2:30, the man would be in Heyman's cab, wouldn't he? "I don't know." Certainly a strange picture was evolving, a picture of Steinie, in one case accompanied, in the other case alone, traveling simultaneously in opposite directions. Abinger now had Stevens with his back to the wall. The final blows were swiftly delivered. "Do you tell the jury that you do not know that Heyman has sworn that Morrison was in his cab at 2:30? "I do not know." "Have you spoken to Heyman?" "Yes." "I suggest that you altered your time to 12 minutes past 3 because that fits in with Heyman's time." "If it had been true," said Stevens, "I should have stuck to my time. I went to the tramway company and made inquiries about the last tram, and on their statement I went to the police and altered the time." What prompted Stevens to make these inquiries never came to light. He was suffered to withdraw, greatly the worse for wear. His story was not disproved, but in the strictest sense discredited. People often try to fix times by events and afterwards discover themselves wrong. But in Stevens' case, the adjustment was a shade too providential for a jury to rely on when a man's life was at stake. By theatrical canons, here should end the chronicle of the cabmen, but for the record, one must perforce make mention of a third, who thought he had picked Steinie up at 3:30 in Kennington and driven him with another man to Seven Sisters Road. He was examined and cross-examined with as much care and solemnity as if nothing had gone wrong with this integrated sequence. The courts, which so often produce orgasms of drama, are not concerned to avoid an occasional anticlimax. The feeling of deflation, however, was short-lived. Battle was joined again on a harmless-looking matter, the evidence of the prisoner's capture and arrest. Steinie was arrested by Inspector Frederick Wensley, who was destined to scale the topmost peak of his profession and become the first chief constable of Britain's CID. He was a square, stern man with a burning sense of mission. As a Templar fought the Saracens, so he fought the world of crime. He had fallen upon Steinie on January 8th at a coffee-house in Fieldgate Street as the latter sat at breakfast. "I said, 'I want you, Steinie,'" Wensley told the court. "I told him he would be detained, but I did not charge him with murder. I did not mention Baron or the murder in his hearing." Needless to say, the inspector was corroborated in toto by every officer who had been personally involved. Nor, it was affirmed, either en route or at the station, had any other person enlightened the accused. He was apparently left to infer, if he so chose, that he was being taken in as a convict upon license who had failed to notify a change in his address. The significance of this presently unfolded. Shortly after Steinie had been shut up in his cell, he asked to see Wensley so that he might make a statement. "You have accused me of murder," Steinie began. "No," Wensley interrupted. "I have done nothing of the kind." Muir attached great importance to this matter as tending to reveal the prisoner's guilty knowledge. When Wensley himself came into the box, Abinger challenged his account of the arrest, suggesting that he had really said, "I want you for murder." Wensley insisted that his version was correct. A lively exchange followed. "Do you pledge your oath that you did not arrest him on suspicion of having committed murder?" "Certainly." On the date of Morrison's arrest, had the police received no statement or information connecting him with this murder? No. When did Mrs. Deach make her statement? I think it was on January 2nd. Do you say that Mrs. Deach's statement does not connect Morrison with this murder? Not beyond the description. When did Caslin, the third cab driver, make his statement? On January 4th. After Caslin's statement, did you not connect Morrison with this murder? I did not connect him with the murder till he was identified. Let me show you a copy of the Daily Graphic of January 9th. Do you see a photograph of the restaurant where Morrison was arrested? I do. If you did not mention at that restaurant that you were arresting Morrison for murder, how could that photograph have got into the paper the next day? It was a very, very awkward question. Wensley had no decisive answer. I don't know, he said. It might have got there by many means. This passage shows Abinger at his best. Acute, tenacious, rigorously germane, equally in command of the situation and himself. Nobody hearing it could possibly feel confident that somehow or somewhere the word murder wasn't used. At this stage, neither side could carry the point further. It was to flare up again several days later in the shape of an unlooked-for and last-minute sensation. Halfway through the fourth day, the Crown case was closed and Abinger opened Steinie Morrison's defense. The official halfway mark and turning point is sometimes followed by a change in atmosphere that puzzles and disturbs the lay observer. So far, he argues, we have heard what can be said against this man. Now we are going to hear what can be said for him. So any change henceforth should operate, not to the prisoner's hurt, but in his favor. This reasoning ignores two cognate factors: the power disposed by cross-examination and the pattern traced by every English trial. The Crown evidence offers defense counsel an Aunt Sally, and rare is the case where he does not in some degree diminish the effect of the prosecutor's opening. During this phase, indeed, it is the defender who attacks and the prosecutor who defends. But with the transfer of the bidding, the position is reversed. It is the defense's evidence that offers an Aunt Sally. It is the prisoner and his witnesses who come under raking fire. It is the prosecutor who gets the opportunity to whittle away the fabric set up by his opponent. The more substantive and positive the defense's case, the greater the risk of undoing and disaster. No defense could be more substantive than an alibi. It was in part upon an alibi that Abinger relied on. Departing from the usual order of events, he called the witnesses on this issue before Morrison himself. The first two were a Mr. and Mrs. Zimmerman, with whom Steinie had been lodging in Newark Street, Mile End. Both swore that on New Year's Eve he had come home about midnight, taken the key of his own room, and then retired to bed. Both swore that he was in the house when they got up the next morning, and the woman said his bed appeared to have been slept in. Both swore that the street door had been bolted for the night, that the bolt was stiff and exceptionally noisy, that they slept lightly and would have heard if the bolt had been withdrawn. The Zimmermans were not without material support. A reputable surveyor said the bolt shrieked terrifically, and a next-door neighbor spoke of seeing Steinie arrive home. Muir questioned these people without notable success. The surveyor's evidence was virtually unchallengeable, and there seemed no ground for disbelieving the assertions of the others that they had seen Steinie Morrison as and when they said. But the inference that he stayed home all night depended on two assumptions. One, that otherwise he must have opened the street door. Two, that the bolt was an infallible alarm. Perhaps Steinie, who had a ground-floor room, made a doorway of his window. Perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Zimmerman slept sounder than they knew. What may conveniently be called the Zimmerman evidence was not, therefore, conclusive. So far as it went, though, it assisted Steinie's case. Nothing was lost by calling it, and perhaps a little gained. The same cannot be said of the evidence of the Brodskys. One wonders why Abinger ever called these two young sisters. They had nothing to say that was really to the point. They claimed to have gone on New Year's Eve to a show at the Shoreditch Empire, where they saw Steinie Morrison sitting near them in the stalls. They did not speak to him, as at that time they only just knew him by sight. Supposing they were believed, what then? Would Steinie's cause be in any way advanced? They would have fixed his whereabouts from 9 until 11, 4 hours before the murder was committed. They would have made liars of the habitués from the Warsaw, who said that Steinie spent the evening in their midst. They would have confirmed a part, an inessential part, of the story that Steinie was presently to tell. But what bearing could the Shoreditch Empire have upon the vital hours after 12? If, on the other hand, the girls were not believed, better by far that they had never come to court. A false witness, who is for this purpose once so deemed by the jury, blackens the prisoner on whose behalf he speaks. Even a genuine alibi is difficult to prove, and often provides a field day for a clever cross-examiner. Muir had had an unexpected rebuff with the Zimmermans, but he was soon making headway with the Misses Brodsky. A single, devastating question and reply wiped the elder sister completely off the map. "Can you tell me," Muir inquired, "any single item in the program which you saw?" "No," Miss Brodsky said. But Muir's real duel was with the younger sister Jane. She was only 16, but mature for her years, and she stood up for herself with energy and spirit. She expressed her certainty that Steinie was the man who had sat in the same row at the show on New Year's Eve. She did something to repair her sister's swift collapse by recalling in detail at least one turn on the bill. "Harry Champion, he was the favorite. He comes on with a ginger wig and sings 'Ginger, you're barmy.'" She spoke with indignation of the attentions of the police. "They fetched me to the station 4 or 5 times. I've signed 3 different statements on 3 different occasions." When Muir began to cross-examine Jane, he used this as the basis for a neat counterattack. "Did you ever at any of these interviews," he asked, "tell the police you had seen Morrison in the Shoreditch Empire on New Year's Eve?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I was angry at the time and would not answer any questions." "What were you angry about?" "The people in the street were talking of policemen coming to my door. I asked them several times not to, but they went on doing it." "You told the police that you had seen Morrison on January 2nd. "Yes." "Also at the Shoreditch Empire?" "Yes." "Why did you keep back from them that you had seen him sitting in the same row of stalls on New Year's Eve?" "They did not ask me the question, and I did not answer them." Jane was hitting back, but she was now on the defensive. Muir, moreover, had reserves of ammunition. Piece by piece he used it to draw damaging admissions. That Jane had lately become closely linked with Steinie. That she had frequently visited him in Brixton Prison. That he had asked her to marry him. That she had told him she would see. It could hardly be maintained in face of this that Jane was altogether free from partiality. To deliver his coup de grace, Muir had both the girls recalled for questioning on a point on which I have just received information. They had sworn that they had paid $1 each for seats. They swore it again and would not be dissuaded. "I suggest," Muir said to Jane, "that on New Year's Eve the price for stalls was raised to 1 and 6. "I do not know that." "And that well before 9 o'clock, when you say that you arrived, there were people standing and there were no seats in the house?" "People may have been standing," Jane responded doubtfully, "but I got 2 vacant seats." In due course, Muir produced the theater manager, who confirmed upon oath that his suggestions were well-founded. The Brodskys, it may be taken, did not impress the jury. It is absolutely certain that they did not impress the judge. After counsel had finished, Mr. Justice Darling questioned Jane, and he made a scathing reference to them in his summing up. "You may come to the conclusion that this is a fabricated alibi, sworn to falsely by the Brodskys." He added, though this caution, "The fact that a man calls a false alibi does not by a long way prove that he is guilty. Is it not very common among people of certain classes and certain nationalities, if they have got a good case, not to rest on that good case? If you have ever talked to anybody who has administered justice in India, you will know that. If you come to the conclusion that this alibi is false, you should not judge it as strictly against the prisoner as if it had been produced by an Englishman." Despite the overtones of sententious insularity, the warning was a wise and fair one. It is questionable, though, whether the jury paid regard once they had heard the words fabricated alibi. If the Shoreditch Empire alibi had been successfully established, its effect upon the case would have been comparatively small. Since it had ignominiously broken down, its effect on the case was likely to be great. This kind of paradox is familiar in the courts. In the late afternoon of the 5th day of his trial, Steinie Morrison went into the box. He remained there the rest of that day, the whole of the day after, and most of the morning of the day after that. For more than half of this time, he was being cross-examined with a severity rare among 20th-century prosecutors. First, however, Steinie placed on record his own story. During December, he said, he had been traveling in jewelry, mostly around the Jewish area of Whitechapel. He made a number of sales which brought him a small return, and during the same period had profited by 2 windfalls. £20 from his mother in Russia, and £35 from a lucky faro game. So far as he was flush at all, here was the reason why. And the flush condition dated back some weeks before New Year. As to the 31st of December, that was simple. He had called in at the Warsaw about 8 o'clock that night and left a flute that he had bought during the day. From the Warsaw he went on to the Shoreditch Empire, where he sat, just as the Brodskys said, in the stalls, alone. After the performance, he returned to the Warsaw, where he collected his flute and had some refreshment. He left there before 12, and on his way home saw Baron standing with a tall man in the street. Baron had called out to him in greeting. Steinie had responded. Then he had made tracks for his lodging and his bed. Next day. Oh yes, why should he deny it? Steinie had suddenly uprooted his home. It was an affaire de coeur, if you care to call it so. More crudely, an arrangement with a woman of the town. It was to go to her he left the sympathetic Zimmermans. It was to spare her feelings he got rid of the revolver. The woman herself had already been called to substantiate at least the first of these assertions. And the days following, Steinie strongly contested the charge that he had flown. He had gone about his business every day in the East End. He had eaten at restaurants in his usual neighborhood. Why, Wensley had arrested him a stone's throw from the Warsaw. True, he had given the latter place the go-by, but that was because on New Year's Eve he had had words with Joe Mintz. "Are you trying to hang yourself again?" Steinie had shouted, and Mintz had darkly threatened to get it out of him. "I believe," Steinie said, "he is getting it out of me now." In Steinie's story, certain things were hard to swallow. The flute, even though one was produced in court. The money, even though there was some play with receipts. The revolver, even though his tenderness with women was established. It all might have been true, but it had an unreal air, like Stevens's excuse for altering the time. A tradition has gradually grown up in England, where persons are held innocent until guilt is proved, that a prisoner, especially on a capital charge, should not be browbeaten or harried in the box. This need not make his cross-examination ineffective. Sir Patrick Hastings, in his questioning of Vaccaire, showed how a great advocate can be a deadly prosecutor without aping the methods of a petty sessions despot. No one should underrate Muir's array of gifts, his shrewdness, his integrity, his mastery of detail, but he belonged, by legal upbringing and nature, to what is now affectionately termed the old school. Defending or prosecuting, it made no difference to Muir. He went all out for the triumph of his side. Steinie's case, with its partisan setting and its personal antagonisms, can only have served to accentuate this tendency. When they faced each other in the crowded court, the burglar with the clean-cut profile and the lawyer with the granite face and heavy jowls, there was no hint of quarter being given or received. It was to be, in the dreadful literal sense, a battle to the death. Muir did not play at once the ace that Abinger had thrust into his hand. He began instead with an inquiry, grim, harsh, and undisguisedly hostile, into the sources from which Steinie's money came. What date was the game of Faro? December 1st. Had Steinie ever been to that gaming house before? Yes, once. Had he any witness who would say he won that money? Yes, the croupier. Had he any witness? "I can give you the name of the croupier," Steinie said. "Have you any witness?" This was the third time of asking, as the tone implied. "I tell you," Steinie repeated, "I can give you the name of the croupier." "Answer my question," Muir rapped out sharply. "He is trying to answer it," Mr. Justice Darling said. "He says he can give you the name of the croupier." It is happily seldom that judges have to protect a prisoner in this fashion. Muir went on with his research into Morrison's finances. Had he the letter that accompanied the money from his mother? It had been destroyed. How much had he made each week selling jewelry? £2 or £2 10 shillings? Might Muir call his attention to the large sum he had spent on personal purchases on one particular day? The implications were still half-veiled, but growing clearer every moment. The crisis was at hand. Abinger stood up. "May I ask my friend to what issue this cross-examination is directed?" "Yes," said Muir, "to the issue whether he was on January 1st in possession of the proceeds of the robbery of Baron." "Ah," Abinger exclaimed, "then that is directed to the credit of the witness, and I object to it." The judge was patently and understandably surprised. "You object, Mr. Abinger? On what ground?" "On the ground that such questions can only be put to a prisoner if the prisoner or his advocate have brought themselves within the provisions of Section 1 of the Criminal Evidence Act, 1898. May I remind your lordship of those provisions?" "I know them quite well," Mr. Justice Darling said. "Have you forgotten your cross-examination of Mrs. Deach?" I have forgotten nothing, said Abinger stubbornly. But did you not impute to Mrs. Deach that she kept a brothel? Will your lordship allow me to deal with this in order? It is a most serious matter. I respectfully call your lordship's attention to the language of the section. Abinger began to read it while the judge waited with what patience he could muster. The prisoner shall not be asked any questions tending to show that he has committed any offense other than that wherewith he is charged, or that he has a bad character, unless the conduct of the defense is such as to involve imputations on the character of witnesses for the prosecution. Well, Mr. Justice Darling said. Abinger now developed an extraordinary argument. At the police court, 2 persons who had given evidence for the Crown later withdrew their statements and said they were untrue. Neither was called by Muir at the Old Bailey. This was a proper and fruitful theme for comment. But Abinger went further. He tried to make it the basis for a justification of his attack on Mrs. Deach. When a man is being tried for his life, he said, and it has been established that 2 witnesses who have given deadly evidence against him have stated that which is untrue, is his counsel to stand mute when a woman who may be of immoral character gives evidence against him? No, he is not bound to stand mute, Mr. Justice Darling said, but if he puts questions that come within the Criminal Evidence Act, he takes the consequences. Abinger was laboring under considerable stress. The all-important battle was being lost. Gathering round Steinie were the lowering shades of doom. It would be barbaric cruelty, Abinger cried, if a man on trial for his life is to have to stand mute by his counsel while a person of the most infamous character gives evidence against him, and if his counsel dares. The judge cut into this outburst. Please do not address me, Mr. Abinger, in such rhetorical terms. I am bound by the Act of Parliament, and I am not to consider whether it is barbaric or otherwise. If it is within the Act, I shall allow the cross-examination. If it is outside the Act, I shall reject it. This logic was unanswerable. Abinger struggled on a little longer. He urged the judge to exercise a discretion, for which the Act does not provide, and talked vaguely about the prisoner having his whole life ransacked. Then, in some distress, he resumed his seat. The judge did not call on Muir to argue. He briefly summarized the law and said that there could be no graver imputation on a woman than that which Abinger had made on Mrs. Deach. Therefore, it seems to me that the conduct of the defense has been such as to involve imputations on the character, certainly of Mrs. Deach, and I think also of Mintz. But I give the go-by to that. I found my decision on the imputation on the character of Mrs. Deach. The consequence is that the prisoner may be cross-examined like any other witness. His privileged position has been lost. The matter is now at large. The floodgates were opened. The questions poured through. Were you first convicted for felony in December 1898? That may be so. Was it for stealing? I was charged with that. Did you get a month's hard labor? I did. Were you sentenced to 6 months hard labor for burglary in August 1899? Yes. Were you arrested in April 1900 for being in possession of the proceeds of a burglary? Yes. And I got 15 months imprisonment for a crime I had nothing to do with. Were you sentenced to 5 years penal servitude for burglary in September 1901? Yes. Did you plead guilty? I believe I did. In August 1905, were you released on license? Yes. In January 1906, were you arrested on the charge of being a suspected person? Yes. When you were arrested, had you a brace and bit in your possession? Yes. And the proceeds of 3 burglaries? Yes. There was much else besides, but this was what really mattered. Steinie, who had left the dock an ordinary citizen, returned a desperado with a dossier of crime. In theory, disclosure of a prisoner's bad character should have no influence on the outcome of his trial. In practice, it almost invariably has. Why otherwise, as Abinger pertinently asked, did Muir insist on raking up the past of Steinie? The effect made on the jury was probably twofold. First, as the judge observed when he addressed them later, they were now liable to misinterpret all the prisoner's acts. "It is almost impossible," said Mr. Justice Darling, "to put as good a construction upon the most innocent thing that man may have done as it was when you believed him to be unconvicted. Second, the jury might be betrayed into assuming a special relationship between the prisoner and society. Here was a burglar, a worthless individual, a man who, if set free, would be a constant malefactor. Why then split legal hairs and balance fine distinctions if we feel that he is guilty? Feel it in our bones." This was the result of introducing character. This was the price paid for asking Mrs. Deach whether her house was a resorting place of drabs. The strain imposed on defending counsel by a long trial for murder has few, if any, parallels. One can think only of the surgeon who, in the operating theater, holds the life of his charge in the skill of his 2 hands. But the surgeon's burden lasts only hours. The barrister's lasts for days, sometimes for weeks, during which the trial absorbs his every waking moment. It does not admit of limited endeavor. It cannot be put aside at a fixed time. An idea conceived in the solitude of chambers may be the precious instrument of acquittal, just as an indiscreet utterance in court may set the seal upon an adverse verdict. Such continuous and anxious concentration tests the nervous stamina of the strongest. This test is 20 times as great when things are going badly, when counsel senses that the tide of events is running inexorably against his client. Abinger had been conscious from the start that his was an uphill and ungrateful task. He had tried to compensate for this by daring tactics and sheer force of will, but these, so far from rendering him aid, had merely served to make his prospects worse. Steinie's chance of freedom dwindled daily, and with it Abinger's poise and self-control. As the trial wore on, his touchiness increased, involving him in scenes that grew more frequent and more violent. In particular, it brought him into conflict with the judge. Judges are not always right, nor always patient. The blame may rest with either side when bench falls out with bar. But here, there can be little doubt where provocation lay. It was Abinger, by his curious conduct of the case, who often forced the judge against his will to intervene. It was Abinger who, by the warmth of his reaction, made these interventions so bitter and prolonged. It was Abinger who tried to make the jury act as arbitrators, and who transformed arguments on cold points of law into passionate tirades and emotional appeals. The friction that resulted reached its unwelcome zenith in the last phase of the trial. Abinger began his final speech late on the 7th day, and did not finish until the next mid-afternoon. He had many points to make, and made them forcibly, but ever and anon returned to one, the issue of character and his grounds for introducing it. He said he was glad that the jury now knew Steinie's history, a statement hard to reconcile with his fight to keep it from them. He reiterated his views about Joe Mintz and Mrs. Deach. He spoke at great length of Eva Flitterman and Rosen, the witnesses from the police court whom Muir had failed to call. "There is a woman," he declared, referring to the former, "who can be found to come to court and invoke the name of the Almighty and swear a lie. And in a murder trial. It is appalling. You have consciences. We have consciences. Has that woman?" The vigor of this was more apparent than its point. The judge, one thinks, was genuinely perplexed. "Mr. Abinger, what do you want? Do you want the prosecution to call Flitterman or not?" "No, my lord. It would be a terrible spectacle. May I respectfully tell your lordship what I want?" "Do, certainly," said Darling, who doubtless longed to know. "I want that woman to be brought into court so that the jury may see the class of woman that she is." The judge responded temperately to this singular request. "But you have got it established that what she says is not true. What is the use of looking at one liar more or less?" Deliberately, Abinger swung round to face the jury. "Gentlemen, I pass from that," he said, ignoring the judge as though he were some petty official. "I pass from that, but you won't. What my lord meant by saying one liar more or less is easy enough to guess. My lord must have been thinking of Rosen." "I was not thinking of Rosen," said Mr. Justice Darling quietly. "I was thinking of King David." This scriptural allusion excited Abinger's scorn. "Gentlemen," he cried, "I wish I had the remarkable abilities of my lord, who is able to allow his mind the luxury of dwelling upon King David when we are discussing this sordid case." A more offensive observation can seldom have been made in open court by counsel about the judge. It speaks volumes for Mr. Justice Darling's magnanimity that Abinger was permitted to proceed without rebuke. Without rebuke, but not without much further interruption, for which the fiery advocate had himself to thank. The judge would not descend to quarrel, but neither would he tolerate distortions of the evidence or transgressions of the rules. As Abinger's speech pursued its turbulent course, as far-fetched theories were outlined, cabinet ministers criticized, and alternative murderers suggested ex-hypothesy, so Darling insisted in cool, firm tones on conformity with the normal practice of the courts. Abinger contested each objection to the last, and long before the end, his speech had ceased to be a solo. It was more like a duet between barrister and judge. When Muir followed Abinger, the duet became a trio. Muir spoke, Abinger protested, Darling mediated, and occasionally the trio turned into a quartet when Steinie interjected something from the dock. Heat always begets heat. Excitement breeds excitement. Hysteria's harvest was now being fully reaped. The whole of the 8th day had been spent on speeches. In the evening, when the court adjourned, Muir, Abinger, Darling, and Steinie were about halfway through Muir's. The end of the trial was now in sight. The moment of decision could not be long delayed. But in an assembly almost jaded with sensations, one last surprise had yet to come. Next morning, when Mr. Justice Darling sat, it was Abinger, not Muir, who stood up in his place. Looking tired and drawn, he had been busy half the night. He applied for leave to call some further evidence. The judge gave his assent, and, amidst a rustling of whispered speculations, Police Constable Greaves made his way towards the box. Who was he? Where did he come from? What had he got to say? The mystery was soon solved. Greaves had been on duty in the charge room at the station when the detectives brought the prisoner in. He had heard Steinie ask, "What am I brought here for?" And he had also heard one of the officers reply, "I told you before, you are on suspicion of murder." Immediately after, they took Steinie to the cells. At the time, Greaves attached no importance to this incident. He only felt himself compelled to take action when he read in the paper an account of Steinie's trial. He then wrote a letter direct to Mr. Abinger, stating what he knew, expressing reluctance to give evidence, but affirming his concern for the interests of justice. As a result, last night he was summoned from his duty to the station, where he was interviewed by Abinger and the head of the CID. If Greaves was telling the truth about the charge room conversation, or to be crudely practical, if the jury thought he was, here finally collapsed one of Muir's most cherished points. No matter now whether Wensley mentioned murder on arrest. Steinie, said Greaves, had heard the word before going to the cells, and it was only in the cells that he had mentioned it himself. Muir swooped down on this supernumerary witness with the relish of a gourmand for an unexpected meal. A policeman, too, was he? A traitor to his side. This made the proffered feast the sweeter. "When did you first speak of this conversation?" Muir asked. 2 or 3 days ago. "To whom?" "Some officers." "Who are they?" "I can't say with certainty," Greaves answered, "but I think one of them was Police Constable Hyler." "Let Hyler be telephoned for," said Mr. Justice Darling, "and not be informed by anyone what this witness is saying." While Hyler was sought out and fetched, Muir went on cross-examining in the fashion that had become part and parcel of the case. Had Greaves frequently been transferred from division to division? Yes. Had he corresponded with an ex-Inspector Syme? Yes. Had Syme accused the police of perjury and corruption? Yes. Had Greaves on one occasion been suspended from the force? Yes. Was that for making a false accusation against a superior officer? Well, not exactly. He was suspended for making accusations he was not able to prove. Meanwhile, Hyler had arrived at the Old Bailey, and an element of lottery crept into the proceedings. Not even counsel knew what he was going to say. Abinger put him in the box, asked his name and rank, then cannily sat down again and left the rest to Muir. Muir must have found the sequel irritating. All Hyler's answers favored the defense. So far as it lay with him, he confirmed Greaves absolutely. They had met on the beat, he said, a couple of nights ago, and Greaves had described what took place in the charge room. His story, as repeated by Hyler upon oath, corresponded with the story that Greaves had told in court. Hyler's record was exemplary. Muir could do nothing with him. He passed from the box unshaken and unsullied, a rare event in this pageant of detraction. Little now remained of Muir's hard-run theory that the murder charge was conjured up in Steinie's guilty mind, but it was the judge's lance that dispatched the dying monster. This point, he said, which has been represented to you as though it were the critical and crucial point of the whole case, is to my mind one of the smallest points in it. It would not seem to me at all unnatural that a man arrested where he was, within a few days of the notorious Clapham Common murder, should assume, even with nothing said, that he was arrested for murder. Envious, perhaps, of the universal loquacity, the foreman of the jury attempted to reply. "May I say?" he began. "No, no." Mr. Justice Darling stopped him instantly. "Don't you say a word. Juries should never express any opinion except by their verdict." Nothing now stood between the prisoner and that verdict, save only Mr. Justice Darling's summing up. This was not the kind of case in which his lordship felt at home. Some judges, not so many, would have taken it in their stride. Avery, for instance, with his impersonal logic, and Travers Humphreys, with his hardy worldliness. But Darling was the exquisite of the bench, the wit, the beau, the laughing cavalier. His delight was to preside over a special jury suit, in which the stake was merely money which both parties could afford, and wherein he was frequently presented with the chance of bandying epigrams with fashionable counsel. The raw inelegance of Steinie's trial can only have induced in him a nausea of distaste. Nonetheless, within the limits of his personality and reputation, Darling tried the Morrison case well. If he could not prevent others from losing their equanimity, at least he carefully preserved his own. If he could not exclude scenes tinged with macabre humor, he refrained from embellishing them with ironic jest. If he could not stop a reference to my lord's literary talents, he did nothing to earn the mockery with which Abinger invested it. If there were moments in the trial when everyone, judge included, seemed to be bobbing about like corks on an unpredictable sea, in perspective it is plain that Darling kept a clear sense of direction and strove gallantly to impress it on the rest. The summing up fittingly crowned his long effort. Into a court still rocking with the clash of factions and echoing with the sound of voices raised in anger, the judge's even accents flowed like a solvent. Whatever could be done to lay the dust, he did. It was a closely knit review, analytical and balanced, which deftly disentangled the true issues from the false. Essentials were exhibited and stressed. Irrelevancies were branded and dismissed. The case against the prisoner was put afresh, shorn of vindictiveness and rancor. The case in his favor was equally examined and cleansed of prejudice implanted or ingrained. Above all, Darling placed the facts in due proportion. No one could tell, no one can tell now, what had influenced the jury most in those 9 days of frenzy. But despite the mass of detail which distracted and confused, Darling tried to keep their minds fixed on the point that mattered. "Are you satisfied," he asked them, "beyond reasonable doubt, that is the man who was in Hayman's cab, in Stevens's cab, in Caslin's cab that night? Think for yourselves. With what certainty could you swear to a man whom you saw on a night like that, by the kind of light there was at those places? Can you feel certain that a man would not be mistaken? Let us assume they were honest. Even then, are you so sure that they really took notice enough, that they had opportunity enough, to be able some days afterwards to swear with certainty to the man that they had driven? Was Steinie identified beyond reasonable doubt? This Darling called the deciding point of the case. If the jury did not share that view by the time the judge had finished, it probably lay beyond the power of mortals to convince them. The jury retired at 8 o'clock that night. It was far from being an ideal time for grave deliberations. Weariness of the body promotes impatience of the mind. Instincts and emotions usurp the place of judgment. 35 minutes later, they trooped back into their box. They had been absent the same length of time as Mrs. Maybrick's jury, and upon such brief communion, delivered the same verdict. The judge passed the only sentence sanctioned by the law. As he ended with the traditional words of solemn benediction, "And may the Lord have mercy on your soul," Morrison's anguish found dramatic outlet. "I decline such mercy," he cried out in despair. "I do not believe there is a God in heaven either." So the curtain fell on the trial of Steinie Morrison, fell as it had risen, with the chief character declamatory in the center of the stage, but renouncing the God he had formerly acknowledged. There was to be an epilogue, however. The authorities needed no prodding from the public to reconsider Steinie Morrison's fate. The verdict had been indirectly disapproved by all the trained intellects qualified to judge. Mr. Justice Darling, on receiving it, had conspicuously abstained from expressing agreement, and had recommended the accused to be guided by his lawyers as to anything you may have to say hereafter. The Court of Criminal Appeal, to which Steinie had recourse, cast its decision in a most significant form. Bearing in mind that we are not entitled to put ourselves in the position of the jury, we can only come to the conclusion that the appeal must be dismissed. To many, therefore, it did not come as a surprise when Mr. Churchill, who then occupied the office of Home Secretary, advised the king to grant Steinie a reprieve. This was done. The usual course was followed. The death sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. It was merciful, if death be the greatest of all evils. But Steinie, behind prison bars, wished desperately to die. He was persistently violent, apparently in the hope that if he made himself intolerable, the reprieve would be annulled. While his solicitors without were pressing for his release, the prisoner within was petitioning to be hanged. Finally, by long and drastic fasting, he undermined his strength and died in Parkhurst Prison at the age of 39. Did Steinie die in the consciousness of innocence, the tortured victim of a terrible mistake? Or did he take the knowledge of his guilt, unconfessed and unrepented, to the grave? In his admirable life of Mr. Justice Darling, Derek Walker Smith reveals the judge's own opinion. "I had no doubt myself," he remarked to his biographer, "that Morrison was guilty, but the view I took was that, had I been a juryman, the evidence that I had heard was not sufficient to prove to me beyond all reasonable doubt that he had committed murder. There lies the distinction between this case and Mrs. Maybrick's. The verdict upon Steinie was doubtful, not outrageous. It was open to dispute and will remain so for all time, because it failed to give the prisoner the benefit of a doubt and was rooted in a trial that gave scant cause for satisfaction.